Nadia, here we are in Cable Street in what is now a rather charming boutique hotel, but 75 years ago was at the epicenter of a really dramatic series of events here in the East End of London. Tell us about what happened.
Well, 75 years ago in Britain, times were hard. Times were hard all over Europe, and people were turning away from mainstream politics towards extremist politics. In Germany, in Italy, in Spain, there was the rise of fascist parties, and people thought that could never happen here. But in fact, there was a homegrown fascist movement in London. It was led by Sir Oswald Mosley, who was himself a member of the English aristocracy. And he looked to Italy in particular, the fascist style of Italy and the style of government in those fascist parties in Europe, for inspiration. In 1934, there was a big rally at Olympia, a big fascist rally at Olympia. And people came to heckle that. People who disagreed with Mosley's policies came to heckle that, and they were beaten up by black shirt thugs. And at that point, sympathy really turned against Mosley. At this point, Mosley decided to turn to the East End to recruit, to the white working class, particularly affected by the effects of the Depression.
What was the backdrop to all of this? What were the conditions in which Mosley was seeking to thrive?
Everyone was living together in poverty in those times, but Mosley took advantage of the idea that it was immigrants who had caused the Depression, who had caused the economic depression. And he blamed the difficult circumstances under which people were living on the Jews. Mosley's recruits were known as the black shirts because they dressed in black military uniforms. And part of the point of this was to intimidate the people who lived in the streets of the East End, to intimidate them with that violent, thuggish military presence. They set out to march through the streets of the East End, but what Mosley really didn't anticipate was the strength of opposition to his tactics and his policies. The police came to Whitechapel Road in order to enable Mosley and his marchers to hold their march through the East End. It was their democratic right to march, and the march couldn't be banned, even though it was very, very clear that this was going to cause a major disturbance. So there were the police on horses, there were the counter-demonstrators. There were 100,000, probably many more, demonstrators in the East End, in the streets of the East End, and something like 10,000 police trying to clear a way through those streets.
What sort of people constituted that massive crowd of 100,000 counter-demonstrators?
The counter-demonstration was organised by a coalition of local organisations and the communists. The communists were very important in rallying together the people of the East End. So there were communists there were trades unionists, some of whom had come from all over the country to support this counter-demonstration. The Battle of Cable Street was not actually fought between fascists and anti-fascists. It was fought between anti-fascists and the police, who were trying to clear a way for those marchers to march through the streets of the East End, which was, at that time, their democratic right. But the counter-demonstrators did not want to let them pass. They blocked Gardiner's Corner on Whitechapel Road, and then later Cable Street, which is where we are now. It got violent, and this had been anticipated by the communists, who had organised medical stations for injuries to be tended to, one of which we're sitting in right now. The battle went on for several hours, and after this time, the police realised that they were actually not going to win, and so they ordered Mosley to move the march, to reroute it, and effectively the march failed.
Now we're sitting opposite the mural in Cable Street, which commemorates these dramatic events in 1936. The mural itself has a history. Tell us about that.
The mural was painted during the 1980s, and it took several years to paint, partly because it was repeatedly defaced by neo-fascist groups. Fascism has resurged again and again, particularly in the East End, which remains an area of immigrant settlement and immigrant residence.
Now, of course, the whipping boys, the immigrants of the time in 1936 in the East End of London, were the Jews. Today's immigrants are the Muslims, from Bangladesh mainly, but from many other parts of the Muslim world. And the heirs and successors of Mosley and the British Union of Fascists are still on the march from time to time here, and indeed their latest incarnation, the so-called English Defence League, tried to recreate, didn't they, the march of Oswald Mosley just a few weeks ago.
There have been many attempts to recreate Mosley's march in the streets of the East End. The National Front in the 1970s, the British National Party in the 1990s. They are very clearly drawing on the heritage of British fascism, and in particular they try to say that they represent English values. And I think it's very interesting that in defending the streets of the East End against the EDL, local residents are showing that actually English values are the values of diversity and tolerance, the values that really have always been the tradition of the East End.